This clearly may be something there beyond the realm of man. And until you thoroughly tested every last close-tested view, I find the more you think you know, the less you really do.
That's true, Dr. Zayas.
Where would we be without THC? 'Cause we know they're lying to us, just don't know to what degree. Yeah, where would we be without THC? The Higher Side Chat Show, Greg Carlwood and Company.
All right, Higher Side Chatters, we know all too well that there is plenty of power hidden behind the veil. And unfortunately for us, the Earth has a rich history of control by vast interlocking networks of think tanks, multinational corporations, secret societies, esoteric orders, and hidden financiers, all aimed at crafting society to their will and molding modern man as they see fit. And while the conspiratorial baton has changed hands many times throughout history, when it comes to the world stage today, it's the post-World War II Nazi-Fascist International that our returning guest Joseph Farrell has been tracking over the course of several years, and their fingerprints seem to be on much more than you might think. Today we're going to focus on the content of his latest two books, Rotten to the Common Core, Public Schooling, Standardized Tests, and the Surveillance State, and also Hidden Finance, Rogue Networks, and Secret Sorcery, the Fascist International, 9/11, and Penetrated Operations, both being further examples of amazing titles and examinations of where we see the game plan of this capstone cabal and the events and initiatives that reek of their underlying agendas. One of my favorite guests and yours, the man who dissects the plan, Joseph P. Farrell. Welcome back to the Higher Side.
Thanks, Greg. Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, honor and a pleasure, my good man. You really are one of the greats. I'm really excited for this. And when I saw that Rotten to the Common Core was coming out, I was pumped because the education and schooling slice of the conspiracy pie is one that I think needs more attention because it affects us all so deeply. I mean, how could it not?
Hear, hear.
You know, we're forced to spend over a decade of our formative years under their nefarious guidance, and it slowly strips us down to nothing more but cogs in the machine, and it leaves people unfulfilled, often for their entire lifetime. But even though compulsory schooling was sort of weaponized from the ground up, they definitely seem to be tightening the screws, so to speak, with this new Common Core curriculum, don't they?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. You know, the title says it all. My co-author and I have both been involved in education in our lives. He still is. I was fortunate enough to get out, although at the time I didn't think I was too fortunate. But, you know, I saw the worst of the worst. And to me, doing the book was kind of a bit of karma for me, being able to expose some of the things that I saw going on as a professor. One of my favorite anecdotes about the whole education methodology as it's taught in American quackademia, and that's how I refer to it, is just shot through with psychological assumptions, philosophical assumptions. But my favorite anecdote from my teaching days was the fact I used to teach a variety of college-level history courses in modern European history, Russian history. Even at one point, I had to substitute for another professor who was on leave for a semester, so I took his diplomatic history of the United States course. And, you know, I had a wide range of courses that I taught. But in teaching modern European history, I used to give essay exams for the most part, because I'm adamantly against the idea of a standardized test being able to capture anyone's process of reasoning. So in the examination, the first question I put in the examination was list 5 things that the Treaty of Versailles stipulated with regard to Germany. You know, easy question. You can write out your 5 answers. And in the question, obviously, I had to spell Versailles, V-E-R-S-A-I-L-L-E-S. Okay.
Fair enough.
And the student answered, and incidentally, the student was an education major, all right? And this just goes to show, as far as I'm concerned, how colossally stupefying and stupidizing the American educational system really is, because this student responded by spelling Versailles, V-E-R-S-I-G-H. Versailles, okay? When it's spelled correctly in the question itself.
Right.
Okay. So, you know, there's such a disconnect here that this whole methodology is made that people aren't even capable of thinking anymore. Mm-hmm. So anyway, that's kind of my anecdote to get us started.
Fair enough. And that really does go hand in hand with what I had as a first question for you, which is early on in the book, you do say that our focus is not so much upon the content or the standards themselves, but rather upon the assessment process and its implicit consequences for parents, students, and the teaching profession.
Right.
Can you elaborate on that assessment process, why it's so concerning, and what it does exactly?
All right. Well, the problem with most of the debate, as far as my co-author and I were concerned with Common Core, is that everybody's focused on the standards themselves. Well, to us, this was kind of a clever distraction because no one, to my mind, that is involved in education would question the idea that there's a certain central core or body of knowledge that education is designed to hand down, whatever the subject matter you might be teaching, be it history or physics or mathematics or music or whatever. There is some sort of core that everybody acknowledges is there, although individuals might draw up a different list as to what that core might be, but there's substantial agreement. The real problem for us with Common Core is not in the actual idea that there should be some sort of common standard of disciplinary content that gets transmitted, but rather the idea that you can assess that core solely on the basis of standardized tests, because what Common Core does is it takes the standardized test philosophy, the ACT, the SAT, Iowa Test of Basic Skills that we all grew up having to fill out our little ovals, making sure to stay inside the lines with our number 2 lead pencils, and so on and so forth, is the idea that these tests can test reasoning process at all. They can't. What they're doing is they're providing you with a pre-selected list of answers that you have to choose from. These answers oftentimes punish the student that is much more aware of the subtleties of certain things than the test makers themselves. So that's the first problem. But the second problem is that Common Core's assessment process supposedly takes the standardized test to a new level by making the test questions individually adaptive and responsive to the way the student answers the previous question. All right? So in other words, we're looking at the standardized test on steroids because, like all such things, these are proprietary property. You cannot go in and look at the algorithms, the people involved in setting up these tests, and so on and so forth. So again, you as a test taker are put into an even more insidious box of having to read the mind of the test preparers and to guess their answers. My classic example of what the standardized test, the problem of the standardized test, is, first of all, it's designed to reinforce an official narrative. Let me give you an example. You might encounter on a standardized test, who assassinated President John F. Kennedy? Well, the answer is Lee Harvey Oswald, right? Mm-hmm. But will those tests ever give you the option of selecting from, say, an answer that would say a conspiracy involving a coalescence of interests involving, anti-Castro Cubans, disenfranchised elements of the American intelligence community or what have you? Because once you get into that kind of question, then you're required to not only know of that research, but be able to argue the case. Well, these tests do not allow you to argue your process of reasoning for anything. Mm-hmm. They simply make you a passive regurgitator of answers that they have pre-selected and that you simply select as the proper response.
Right.
And they would argue that this is all scientific. Well, we go into a lot of detail about some of these test questions that have appeared on previous tests, and they're anything but. You might be able to come up with a correct answer in a mathematics question, but again, part of deriving that answer is to show how you derive it. I mean, that's part of the mathematical process itself. It's part of mathematical proofs. So it's not simply selecting an answer. It's showing how you reason to that answer. And none of these tests do that. So Common Core puts this all on steroids by making it individually adaptable your response is individually adaptable to the individual student. So this to me is the indicator that it is a huge data mining operation, number one. And number two, what the standardized test, particularly in this instance where it's individually adaptive, what this means is that the test itself becomes kind of a loyalty test. Do you accept the standard narrative? Are you capable of knowing it and regurgitating it, or do you not? So, there's any number of ways to look at this, but the bottom line is, for us, it's just a massive expansion of the surveillance state, and it's handing over, in the guise of education, to these testing corporations mountains of data, which, again, are proprietary to them. They can, in turn, use that data, sell it, and so on and so forth. So, as far as we're concerned, it's a huge, huge scam.
I'm right there with you. Cheers to that. And I love the old George Carlin line that they just want obedient workers. And I think that's the best term for what they're trying to churn out.
Yeah.
And, I got some friends, I think a lot of people do, who might be in the teaching profession. And I thought about, as I was going through this book, how would they respond to some of these things? And really the question that I think they don't ask, that you do in the book, is when was the last time that a teacher went to a seminar or something to study their actual discipline, as opposed to the new standard for how they're supposed to, quote, manage their class?
Right, exactly. American quackademia is focused on what I consider the claptrap of educational methodology. So in other words, school districts will pay you to go to conferences, or require you in many cases to stay after school and attend the latest workshop, where you basically are subjected to all sorts of childish activities that are passive aggressive in nature, designed to make you be a team player and all of this, codswallop. But basically, you would be hard pressed to find a teacher, say a teacher of English, that would be paid to go attend a conference in the latest scholarship in literary criticism, or the latest findings on such and such an author, in scholarly research, or if you're a mathematics teacher, going to a conference of mathematicians and hearing the latest papers in mathematics. They're not interested, in other words, in the content of the disciplines that you are supposed to teach. What they're interested in is making the teacher a kind of equivalent to a paralegal. In other words, the teacher is now kind of a licensed parapsychiatrist who gets their certification in applying the latest psychological or educational theories in the classroom. And that's what they spend most of their time at these conferences, quote unquote, learning to do. Again, for me, this is a clear sign that American education is failing, simply because, an English teacher is there to teach English, not to teach the latest psychological theory. So, this is the other big problem that we're facing with all of this claptrap. There's another thing, since you raised this issue, that we learned about after the book came out. A teacher emailed me and said that she is absolutely refusing to go along with Common Core because it also stipulates a universal kind of lesson plan for the teachers in her school district. Mm-hmm. So in other words, whether or not this teacher's students are ready at a certain time to progress on to the next level of whatever discipline they're supposedly studying, she's mandated to proceed regardless. So in other words, what teacher can teach in an atmosphere like that? This is just another example of the centralization mania that is afflicting this country. And we know that centralization doesn't work for the simple reason that every group of human beings, from elementary school classrooms all the way up to Wall Street, every group of human beings is going to respond differently. So, the whole thing is shot through with all of these assumptions that, as far as we're concerned, just mean that the whole thing is a huge scam. It's not going to fix anything. The only thing it's going to do is make these companies even richer at the public trough.
Yeah, well said. And those are pretty telling elements. And let's look at some of the people and the money behind this thing, because people tend to think philanthropists like Bill Gates and their foundations who fund education are doing charitable works, just the best altruistic stuff. But
of course.
What are the red flags that you see that tell you that there's a deeper agenda here? They don't have our best interest at heart.
Well, first of all, the idea that these foundations are philanthropic is the first problem. What these foundations are, and we have a chapter in the book about foundations themselves and how they arose and what they really do. What they do educationally is they act as gatekeepers for the officially approved narratives, is what they do. And they fund those who agree with those narratives and withdraw funding or keep funding from those who don't. So this is the first problem. The second problem with these foundations, and this is an observation that was not made by us, it was actually made by the Council of the Reese Committee in the U.S. House of Representatives back in the 1950s that was investigating foundations, a fellow by the name of Rene Wormser. And Wormser made the observation that what these foundations in effect are the way that the wealthy can retain control of their wealth while putting them into a special chartered entity that avoids taxation because these are nonprofit entities. So in other words, it gives them a huge amount of power. And he made the observation that because of this phenomenon, the closest analog to them were the medieval military orders like the Templars or the Hospitallers or the Teutonic Knights. Because what were they? Well, they were essentially tax-exempt charitable foundations that allowed the intergenerational accumulation of capital on the one hand and allowed the people that were members of that order, or in this case foundation, to control the uses of that capital and to drive political agendas. I look at Mr. Gates and his backing of Common Core with a very jaundiced, skeptical eye for the very simple reason that, again, under the computerized, individually adaptive assessment process, which again is standardized testing on steroids now, what he's really doing is driving an agenda simply designed to put more and more profits into his computer technology companies. That's all it is. So this is not an education solution. There's even a case that we put in the book of a Common Core conference, a get-together, where they invited everybody except, guess what? Teachers.
Of course.
They invited administrators and superintendents and principals and so on and so forth, but no teachers. Because, of course, that's where the rubber meets the road, and most teachers I've talked to are simply appalled at what they see in Common Core. So, again, I really question whether or not these foundations really are philanthropic to begin with. I think all along they've been designed to promote the agendas of the super rich. And, we see where that's led us.
Yeah, not only is it better for them in terms of expanding wealth and power as well as limiting liability, they also get the PR currency for all these, quote, noble deeds that nobody ever looks deeper on.
Exactly.
So if we go back a few years and look at who laid the foundation for what we have now and who should we be holding responsible, you paint a nice bold target on this Wilhelm Wundt character as well as John Dewey. Can you talk to us about them a bit and some of the history here?
Well, this is very, very crucial for people to understand why American education, and I'll be just very blunt here, why American education sucks. All right. Wilhelm Wundt was basically one of the founders not only of psychology, but of educational psychology. And his philosophy was that if we were going to put psychology on any sort of scientific footing at all, we had to be able to reduce it to a materialistic approach, because only the material in that kind of nifty Cartesian dualism between matter and mind could be measured. The mind was something that was personal, subjective, and all of that. It couldn't be measured. You couldn't take out a tape measure and measure it. So he began, for want of a better expression, the materialistic turn in psychology. And he set up a laboratory at the University of Leipzig in Prussia at the time and began to churn out students that he had trained in this approach to psychology. And basically, it's very important to remember that Pavlov was one of his students, because Wundt took the approach that because of the fact that the then reigning scientific paradigm was materialism, that humanity itself, the human being as an individual and humanity as a collective, was basically a stimulus response mechanism. So in other words, the educator had to design appropriate environments in the classroom, and this is why teacher certification here is now important, and why I suggested earlier that the teacher is nothing but kind of a parapsychologist in this view, because the teacher is supposed to design the most apt stimulus response environment for the student to learn in. So there's your turn away from the content of the discipline to a focus on the methodology of actually communicating that discipline in that context. So he trains a whole generation, either directly or through people that he has trained who then train others, who influence American education at the end of the 19th century and all the way on into the 20th. And I would even include people like George S. Counts or James Bryant Conant of Harvard University, or even Henry Chauncey, who sets up the educational testing service in Princeton, as people that were imbibed with this philosophy of humanity as a stimulus response mechanism. It works out very well if you have that philosophy for Madison Avenue and Wall Street, because you're creating a generation of consumers rather than people who can think critically about anything. So it's had a huge, huge effect on American education. Now, you mentioned Dewey, but there's a whole host of other people we could mention here. Thorndike, the fellow that I forget what his name was, Abraham Exner, I think was his name, that set up his own kind of progressive education school where he wanted to test some of these ideas, and he called it the Lincoln School to give it a nice patriotic sounding American name. Mm-hmm. And we bring out the fact that John D. Rockefeller sent his three sons, David, Lawrence, and Nelson Aldrich, to this school where, as a result of their experience, all three of the Rockefeller brothers had difficulty reading. They don't enjoy reading. In fact, they find it tedious. They find it difficult. Well, I'm sorry. If you're a member of the elite and you've sent your kids to that kind of school, then you're ending up with a stupid elite. And we're in an election cycle that certainly is proving that to be the point. They've surrounded themselves with their own philosophy to the point that they can't even think outside their own narratives anymore. So this is the other danger of Common Core, I think, and the whole progressive education philosophy, the materialism that underlies it. You're basically, to paraphrase C.S. Lewis, you're turning out a whole generation of men without chests. In other words, of men without virtues or moral principles or anything like that. And that is, to my mind, that's the crucial component of being able to think critically about anything, about a narrative, and so on and so forth. So it's had a huge effect, this Wilhelm Wundt character. And, the interesting thing here that we have to ask ourselves, Greg, is why would American educators at that time use an example of Prussian education? Now, we're not even just talking, Imperial Wilhelmine Germany here. We're talking Prussian, where the whole philosophy of education under Wundt was we're turning out people to be good and obedient, there's that key word, and loyal products for the state, because the state is all-consuming. The state is all-powerful in the Prussian model. Why would Americans turn to that model as a thing that they want to model American education on? Why did they abandon the tradition that we had inherited from, the Oxford universities in England, and which played a huge role in setting up our own big name universities, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and so on? Why would we abandon that tradition for something inherently alien to our philosophy of government, to our philosophy of culture, to our understanding of individual liberties, and so on and so forth? Why would we do that? And the answer is, when you read these people, they really do believe in that Prussian philosophy. They really have abandoned their commitment to that Anglo-Saxon tradition of individual skeptical critical inquiry. So, it's staring us right in the face if we stop and think about the obvious part of it.
Mm-hmm. Well said. And I do love that Rockefeller anecdote because for once it looks like they actually got a little bit of a taste of their own medicine. And
Yeah.
it's nice to see that once in a while. But I guess, you kind of alluded to this, but it does seem like that has shown itself in the game plan today. They don't seem to be quite as nimble or effective in some ways, or at least as quick to be able to pivot as they once were, wouldn't you say?
Right. Well, yes, I would agree with you wholeheartedly. Several years ago, on the late George Ann Hughes' radio show called The Bite Show, I pointed out that the so-called elite really seems to be very, very stupid. In other words, they are using the same playbook because they don't know anything else. They have dumbed themselves down in the process of dumbing everybody else down to the point, and this is something that Catherine Fitz made me aware of last year. Last year in July, The Economist magazine in Great Britain, which, most people think of as the magazine of record for the British oligarchy, all right? Well, last July in 2015, The Economist magazine ran an op-ed piece about the calcification, this is their words, not mine, the calcification of the American political class. And the effect of the article was, you're kidding, you're running Jeb Bush and Hillary Clinton again? Can't you guys come up with something different? Well, the answer is no, because our own political elite has been calcified. It can't think outside of its own construct and its own box. And this, the election that we're seeing now, as far as I'm concerned, is really a referendum. It's not an election in any classic sense. It's really a referendum on, do we want more of this global centralization and these idiots running the world and running it according to a paradigm that's never been tested or proven and seems to be breaking down under the strain, or do we want something different? I really look at it that way. And if you factor in education here and the materialist turn that it took in the 19th century, I think what you're looking at is the collapse of that materialist philosophy. These people are clinging to it, Greg, doggedly. When science itself, particularly quantum physics, is increasingly pointing not toward a material primacy, but really towards the primacy of mind and of consciousness itself. Mm-hmm. So why would we stick to Bill Gates and these other people that are advocating the same old on steroids and not reassess the basic philosophical principles that have led to this educational mess? That, as far as I'm concerned, Greg, the way to solve it is, first of all, get rid of the requirement for teacher certification. It is to the point. I have a PhD from the oldest English-speaking university in the English-speaking world, all right? Now, incidentally, that university has never been accredited by any American accreditation agency, thank goodness. But I cannot go into a high school classroom and teach American history or European history or whatever because I don't have a teaching certificate from some teacher's college where I spend time learning the latest educational claptrap and playing silly games. And quite literally, that's oftentimes what these courses consist of, is playing games.
Right.
So we have to examine the whole structure as far as we're concerned. And this is really kind of what we were arguing in the book. We have to examine the whole structure itself. And, we're in basic agreement with John Taylor Gatto, the famous American teacher that's written so many books.
Yes.
And he's come right out and said the whole system has to be completely scrapped. No amount of money is going to fix this because the assumptions and the institutions put into place on the basis of those assumptions are completely fallacious.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the elite are getting what they pay for. They built this thing to churn out obedient workers, and it's working just great.
Yeah, and now we have bank managers that can't balance a checkbook, so it's no wonder that we have trillions of dollars unaccounted for at the Pentagon or in this bank or that bank, because when you're dealing with stupid people, the immoral people, the greedy people, the criminal class can thrive.
Right. And that can be a silver lining or an even scarier assertion, depending on your perspective.
Precisely.
So we have this campaign to dumb us down, and then we could also throw in this element of drugging us down, which is something that happened a little bit later, right?
Yeah. Well, we don't talk about that much in the book, but that's quite true. I mean, I have known and dealt with people that are genuinely ADHD, adult attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. I've met and dealt with people like that. So I do think it does exist. However, I think the other problem here is that basically, and this is particularly true of little boys, less so of little girls, but basically they're diagnosing simple, young male behavior all the time as ADHD, and they're drugging these kids with all sorts of stuff that basically turns them into zombies. Mm-hmm. Not in contact with their emotions, not in contact with their thought, and above all, not able to reason or think critically. This goes back to why I always insisted as a professor on giving essay exams, because it's in the act of writing that you learn the art and craft of analyzing a position and arguing either against it or for your own position or for that position or what have you. It's in the act of writing that you're actually reasoning something, not simply spitting out an answer that the student is having to guess that the professor or the teacher or some hidden committee compiling test questions for standardized tests wants. So for me, the critical thing as a professor back when I was teaching was to be able to see if someone was genuinely engaged intellectually with the subject matter and able to understand it and argue a position based on the facts and data that they had been presented. That for me was the key element. And you can't get that on a standardized test, and certainly can't get it on a test that is now computerized, individually adaptive, according to the latest psychological theory by a committee of test compilers in Princeton, New Jersey, or in Seattle, Washington, or wherever.
Mm-hmm. Right, and the almighty infallible system. It's like,
yes, exactly.
Right, they're using the teachers as scapegoats and trying to say, the reason the schools suck is because these teachers. There's no standard.
It's the teachers. Oh yeah, exactly. It's all the teachers' fault. And if anything, what this system has done, Greg, is it has created what I call the subversive teacher and the subversive student. Because there are, and if you're a teacher listening to this, and you probably have experienced this in your own career, because the system dictates to you that you have to do such and such by such and such a time and get such and such a result on such and such a standardized test. And you realize at some point when you're in the classroom teaching a group of people that this is simply not going to work for these people. So you teach your discipline to the best that you can. And it's in those subversive moments, usually between classes, that you have with students who are beginning to ask the right kind of questions and question what is going on in the system, that you have those conversations that expose the whole thing. So in other words, you're creating an underground here that is trying to preserve what's left of the Western civilization and its traditions of education by content and discipline and critical reasoning ability. But you're working against a system that is designed not to do that. Mm-hmm. So you're literally creating a black market for these things. And I suspect eventually that's what's going to happen.
Right.
You're going to have a massive black market of private tutors, of people that can afford it and want their kids to learn something and learn of value. Mm-hmm. And the other thing that this system does, and I'll be quite frank, and I saw this over and over again when I was teaching, the other thing that this system does is it produces waves of boredom, tidal waves, tsunamis of boredom.
Right.
Because most students are talked to at such a stupid level by the system that they know they're being talked down to. Mm-hmm. I can't tell you how many times I heard when I was a professor, Greg, students would come up to me after the end of a course or something and say something to the effect that you're the first real professor I've had.
Huh.
because I insisted at teaching at a genuinely collegiate level and not the dumbed down level that most professors now teach at in this country, because the product that they're getting from the public education system is so colossally stupid. Witness and case in point, the student who can't spell Versailles correctly when I've spelled it correctly in the test question itself.
Right, right.
They just don't make the connection.
Man. Yeah, in terms of the pharmaceutical initiative, that has got to be one of the best things that my parents did for me, was reject those attempts to get me on that Adderall train, because they were there. And I have a note here that seems kind of disjointed, maybe connected to that pharmaceutical initiative, to ask you about the Society for the Investigation of Human Oncology. This might be where some of the deeper nefarious agendas show up, I think.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. That was a CIA front back in the 1950s. That was a CIA front for the mind control projects, Project Artichoke, MK Ultra, and things like this, that was set up. They, in turn, approached the Educational Testing Service, that huge nonprofit conglomerate that squats like, a cancer in the middle of the American education system, founded by Henry Chauncey and kind of wet nursed into existence by James Bryant Conant of Harvard University during the 50s. And of course, the Educational Testing Service is the service that owns the Scholastic Aptitude Test, one of the famous standardized tests in this country. Well, they approached the Educational Testing Service to see if the service could design for them various tests related to personality and so on and so forth. So in other words, whatever the details of this association are, the implication here is that the CIA recognized the power of the tool of standardized testing as a tool of social engineering and therefore of mind manipulation. Now, I mention that because we point out in the book that this was really the reason that Henry Chauncey wanted to found the Educational Testing Service. He and James Bryant Conant had the idea that, we need to create a new kind of aristocracy in this country, an aristocracy of merit. And we're going to go search for the best and brightest people, and we're going to give them better education than the kind of education we're giving everybody else. And the way to do this is to test on a national level and to quote unquote test scientifically, enter the standardized test. In other words, the test itself becomes a sorting mechanism. You get certain scores, you're eligible for certain scholarships, you're eligible for entrance into this major university instead of that little university out there in the plains of the Midwest somewhere, and so on and so forth. So it becomes a tool of the American oligarchy to perpetuate their power and bring other people in. The problem is, of course, that they selected what can only be called a kind of computerized phrenology to be able to do this. The old idea that you could measure a person's mental capacity by taking calipers and measuring the brain. When it's interesting to me because they even adopted the Iowa Test of Basic Skills at one point. I remember seeing this as a kid, would have these calibers, these phrenology calibers, as part of its logo, stamped right on the test. So, they've adopted a very blunt measurement instrument here to try and identify the more gifted students. And in illustration of this fact, we point out in the book a number of sample test questions from the 1960s. In science, particularly in physics, which is kind of my bailiwick, where the answers on the SAT that the Educational Testing Service wanted were quite patently and simply wrong, okay? And they were taken to task at the time by a mathematician by the name of Banish Hoffman, who wrote a wonderful book called The Fallacy of Testing, all right? And Hoffman, just to let you know who he was a member of the Institute for Advanced Study. He was a personal friend of Albert Einstein. So this guy is no fly-by-night. And he just absolutely savages the Educational Testing Service on some of these questions. But he points out in one case He had a student who had taken the SAT and also taken a test, a standardized test, for a National Merit Scholarship, in which the word intentionally appeared in a list of words which they were to identify as being misspelled. And the word intentionally was misspelled with an S, all right? And the Educational Testing Service, of course, wanted the students to identify this as the misspelled word. But the problem was this student was smart. This student had read the works of S.I. Hayakawa on the nature of symbolic logic and so on and so forth, where Hayakawa had intentionally misspelled that word to create a word that had a very specific technical meaning. So in other words, the word wasn't misspelled, and the student knew that it wasn't misspelled. He just knew more than the test preparers at the Educational Testing Service.
Wow.
Yeah, you see, so this is the problem. You can have a committee of experts, and there's always going to be some fallacy of the footnote somewhere that a bright student is going to be punished for knowing on the basis of these standardized tests, because it puts them into the position of having to guess, do they know this or do they not know this? And if they don't know this, then I select this answer. But if they do know this, then I select another answer. Mm-hmm. So it's not a scientific measure of the student's intelligence. It's only a measure of whether or not they can guess what's in the mind of a committee that they don't even know. And now Bill Gates wants to put all of this on computers and make the questions themselves individually adaptable by some algorithms and theories of some anonymous committee? No. No.
Boom. There it is, man. So to get a little bit deeper and maybe also tie this into some other work that you've done, I've heard you discuss the fairly complex elements where we see the larger transhumanist agenda as well as a tie-in of ancient esoteric doctrine playing a huge role in the changes that they're making to us through the schooling system. Maybe you can elaborate on that a bit and help us understand this deeper crossroads.
Well, I'm not quite certain as to what you're getting at, but my fear is that with this idea of individually adaptive, computerized, standardized tests, that what they're building out is basically two things. They're driving two memes into society. The first meme is, if it appears on a computer screen, it's true, which would be, the 21st century equivalent of, if Walter Cronkite said it on CBS Evening News, it's true, okay? Or if the New York Times says it, it's true, all right? Now, we see that mass media paradigm that held sway throughout the latter half of the 20th century breaking down. But what is being substituted in its place is, if it's on the internet, it's true. If it's on an ebook, it's true, and so on and so forth. So they're driving that meme. In other words, they're driving a dependency on machines, and they're driving a kind of intellectual passivity before the agenda here. But the other thing that they're doing, in my mind, Greg, is they're also trying to create, by means of driving that meme into society, they're trying to create the acceptability of the merger of man and machine. And to me, that is the most disturbing thing, because you see the transhumanists wanting to implant people with microchips and so on and so forth, or download and upload memories into computers so that they can have their virtual immortality and, all of this happy nonsense. To me, that's the most frightening thing, because in that kind of environment, what you're taking out of the learning process itself is the human mentor, the teacher, the professor, whatever. You're taking out of the process the human element, and you're substituting a very mechanistic element. You're reducing the student to a machine. You're reducing the student to an algorithm. And this is what I find to be the real heart of the problem here. And if we can go a step further and envision this philosophy in place, say, in the next century, well, why even bother having a school where you interact with other human beings. Why not just learn online at home? And there's some places doing this already.
Mm-hmm.
There's some places, they're not building libraries full of old-fashioned things called books, and, where you're interacting with other old-fashioned things like students and teachers. You're doing this all online.
Right.
I've got news for people. I write all of these books, but most of the information that are in my books, you cannot find on the internet. They're in old books. They're in obscure books. They're in books that you have to literally buy and mark and read.
Right.
So they're also the other transhumanist impulse. The third thing I think they're driving here is they are attempting, by means of all of this, to cut people off from their own culture and tradition. And to me, that is the central core of the problem. Because in the absence of a culture and tradition, basically anything goes.
Right. Yeah, well said. Those definitely are major problems, and those old physical books can't be changed the way digital Kindle books can.
Bingo, bingo, bingo.
Yeah.
I tell people all the time, Greg, that the only canonical version, in other words, the only authoritative version of my books, is the printed hard copy. It is not I format my books myself on my computer to look a certain way on the page.
Mm-hmm.
And that's all eradicated on an ebook. And more importantly, on an ebook, if you're using that as your source, what page do you cite? What's the page number that it's on?
Right.
It changes everything. Mm-hmm. And I was taught when you're citing things, you cite as specifically as possible. So this is the other thing that they're doing in American education. I've ranted and raved on this a lot. The standards now for citation of a text, the so-called MLA or AP style manuals, would not have been acceptable when I was going to public school as an accurate citation. When I cite, it's the author, it's the publisher, it's the place of publication, it was the year that it's published, the edition if it's there, and the precise page on which you can find either the point I'm referencing or the quotation I'm using. But modern methods of citation, oftentimes, particularly in education departments, believe it or not, don't require you to cite the page. You simply cite the author and the year, and then you have to flip back to the biography, and there you find, lo and behold, you're citing a 500-page book and just telling the poor person on the other end, go read this 500-page book. It's in there somewhere. To me, this is, if I were to have received or submitted a paper like that when I was in high school, guess what grade I would have received for it?
Not a good one.
Not a good one. Mrs. Connors in my World Lit class in Lincoln Senior High School in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, great big handed that paper back to me with a great big red letter F. And red letter F. But this is how the standards have changed. Rightly so.
Right.
But this is how the standards have changed to what's happening now. Since I was going to school to what's happening now. Students aren't even aware of the fact that what they're being taught in terms of citations itself is slipshod. They're not even aware that there was another method that